Welcome to the Startup Grind.
So, David Cancel, you founded several companies, most recently Performable, which was acquired by Hubspot in 2011. You've been there for some time. We'll get to that. I wanted to start with, in Startup Grind fashion, typically we just kind of tell us about where you were born, what your parents did for work, what your aspirations were as a kid. How did you find your way into all this?
Hello, Dave Cancel. Let's see. So I was born in the Bronx, right? And some Bronx people here. So I once got detained at the Canadian border. I didn't have my passport. Sorry, tangent. And the way that I proved that I was a U.S. citizen was I said the Bronx. And they said, you can't make that up. So anyway, the Bronx. So I was born in the Bronx, but I grew up in Queens, New York, a town called Forest Hills, and my dad was a contractor, my mom was a seamstress, although she also babysat a bunch of kids, growing up, and so they were both immigrants, and had worked insane number of hours. I always laugh at gaining context for starting a company, and we always feel like we work a lot, but if I look back to my parents, I feel like I still haven't worked nearly a week as hard as they did. And so I grew up in that environment, and I didn't know what a startup was growing up. I think my wife says that I ended up doing this because I don't like being told what to do. And, stubborn, but I always wanted to create something. By the time I was a teenager, I started to see those magazine covers that were like Entrepreneur magazine. I still didn't know what an entrepreneur was, because if you open one of those magazines, they just sold you franchises. So you know what the hell it was. But I found it interesting, right? And that's how I started to think about starting a company. And my first company was a long time ago. And all my companies since then have been kind of results of obsessions. So I was telling Bridge before that I have an addictive personality, super addictive personality. So this is the best way to use my addictive personality. I'm prone to many obsessions. This is one of them, and this is just the rabbit hole that I haven't got out of yet. So it just keeps going and going and going, and the learning never stops.
So your first company was Bolt in '96.
Yeah.
Kind of at least what feels like to me, the early days.
long time ago. Yeah.
How did you get into that? Tell us about how you either had the idea, or with whom did you work, and how did that shake out?
Yeah, Bolt, ELT.com was a social network. Although there was no such thing as a social network, that category didn't exist back then, so we called it it was a community property on the web, and we were taking hints at a lot of desktop software that existed back then, like bulletin boards, AOL, CompuServe, Prodigy, a lot of stuff that many of you probably don't know what it was, but it kind of precursors to the internet, right, or at least the commercial internet. And we were basically looking at communities a lot, and kind of obsessed about bringing that onto the web. Bolt, I was working kind of in consulting like most people do. I'm a New Yorker growing up in Manhattan. And working for lots of banks and doing lots of boring kind of development. That stuff was more client-server work. Again, this is a long time ago. I remember what client-server work was, but I was obsessed about the web, right? And since the day that I used Mosaic and I used Netscape Navigator, I was obsessed about the web. And I found these two people that were working on, they didn't know what they were working on yet, but they were working on websites, they said, through newsgroups, if you remember what newsgroups were. And so I hooked up with them. We were in Soho on Broadway, and worked on building some websites for third parties a little in the beginning, and then we ultimately created this internal project called Bolt, the social media site, social network site.
So Bolt was, it sounds like you worked on that for about 3 years, 96 to 99, getting right around to the crash that was probably before the crash.
Before the crash, yeah. So, Bolt was an incredible story because, like everything at that time, we had this idea. We started pretty early. 96, end of 96. And then by the, end of 98, 99, we probably had 100 and some odd people working on it at that point. And we had ended up raising money from someone locally here, Highland Capital, but also Ford, AOL, a bunch of big companies that were trying to get closer to teens. Our social network was really focused more on teens than, let's say, Facebook was. So Facebook started out in the college market. We started out really more in like the high school market.
You had millions of users, right?
Yeah, by the time I left, we had like 5 million users at that time, and we were the largest, what was called community site on the web, according to third-party metrics, and which was huge at that time. I mean, everyone was mostly dialing in at that point, right? Through modems, and like ISDN lines were pretty expensive. So our average user session at that time was like 56 minutes, which like over dial-up, insane, right? So it was like insanely, sticky, right? And we ended up, in that 3 years, like growing pretty fast, having millions of users, which was, 5 million is like nothing today, but back then it was insane. And then building all the software, and I was telling Bridge, most of it I forgot at this point that we built, but there are some screenshots still on like Wikipedia and other places where I can look back and remember and see like, oh, we had most of what you would see in a social network today, right? Like we had all that stuff back then, but timing is everything, right? And I left in '99 before the crash to follow my girl to Boston, who's now my wife. So my wife we worked together at the same time, and she had a different thing that we started internally. That was another kind of like social network, and that got acquired by Oxygen Media, which is a cable TV channel. And that team went over to Oxygen. When that project got done, she wanted to move back to Boston. She grew up in this area. I had never been to Boston before, not once. And but I said, oh, okay, yeah, I'll move up here.
So you moved up here blindly?
Blindly, wow. Yeah. And did not visit in the winter.
So that sounds like it was around 2000, probably.
99.
Oh, 99. So still before the crash.
Still before the crash.
It looks like you spent a little bit of time at Lycos, Fire Zone.
Yeah. So brief stints. Like I came up here again. I didn't know anybody up here, and one of the things that I found really interesting coming up here was that hiring engineers was so easy relative to what I was trying to do in New York. Like again, we started Bolt in '96. There were no examples yet, no public examples. It's even before Yahoo going public. And so in New York, I spent all my time trying to convince engineers who had jobs at Goldman to like come work at my crappy startup, right? Like, and they would come to interview like in suits and get driven in a Lincoln Town car to the interview, right? And they would come to our office, it was in Soho, but we had like no air conditioning with like a tenement. And there I had to try to convince them like, here's why you should work for us. Like, not gonna get paid enough, you're gonna sweat, like you're gonna work all the time. There's no Lincoln Town car that picks you up. There's like, it was a pretty hard proposition to convince people to come join a startup at that point.
Yeah, the stick around.
Yeah.
So tell us about Compete. It sounds like that may have been the early days of your data obsession.
Yeah.
Because you spent a lot of time working on that.
Yeah.
7 years.
7 years, my longest. So, one thing that I didn't mention about Bolt was like Bolt was a social network, but the way that we, from the beginning, thought that we were going to make money with Bolt was actually we had something called Bolt Labs, which was like it was basically surveys, right? Like we had a way to survey in a good way, like and poll people on the site, and that's why brands were really interested in the network. And so we had this thing, it was all qualitative surveys, qualitative research that we were doing on kind of teen market. And so that actually started the data obsession back then. Post-crash, so the crash happened in March of 2000, and then Compete started in November of 2000. So it was like post-crash. It's like, again, like another lesson timing, like it's not really, it was a pretty stupid time to start a company. Yeah. But luckily we ended up raising, we got seeded by Idea Lab, which was an incubator, and then we raised a Series A like 30 days later, which was like unheard of at that time.
What was, when you were raising money, outside of the, the largest crash of our generation, what was it that made you stand out? Like, what was it that made investors see that you weren't just pets.com or,
Yeah. So, I figured it out afterwards, because it was crazy. Nobody at the time, Idealab had seeded us, pets.com, and they probably had a portfolio company that they must have had at least 50 companies, operating companies at the time. We were the only one that was able to raise money. Like no one out of those 50 ended up raising money at that time. And we raised a pretty big Series A at the time. It was a $6 million A with one investor, Charles River Ventures, and I didn't even know why they. We had no software. We had like pretty simple pitch and pretty simple idea, and I couldn't figure out like why they were so eager to invest, and then I figured it out later on. Right? And it was for a number of reasons. One, it was my partner there had been obsessed about this market for a long time, so he was already predisposed to do something in this market, and he had a couple. He was the managing director of the firm at that point, so he had a lot of sway and within the firm to be able to make the deal happen. So that was one reason. But the other reason, because I had never met him before, was that I was good at hiring, right? And he had lost somebody to me. I didn't know that at the time. So at one company before that, FireZone, which I was at briefly. He had been trying to hire some VP he offered this VP, a friend of mine, I didn't know this at the time, you could work at any of my companies, right? Because he really wanted this guy. This guy turned him down and he said, no, I'm going to go work with this guy that I really like. And he was like, who's this guy? He was like, oh, this guy David Cantor, right? He didn't know who I was. I was just a nameless thing. During the meeting, I could see that he was figuring out, he was like, by the end, he was like, oh, it's you.
This is the guy, right?
I lost, his name is Mitch. I lost Mitch to you. Like, you took Mitch from me. Oh, I told Mitch he could work at any one of my companies, right? Like, again, it's all like the venture raising money is like dating in some ways, right? It was like all like, oh, wait, no one says no to me. Like, but this guy said no to me. And like he went to work with you? Like, I don't know, you must know something, I guess. It was basically, those were the two reasons that I think that he invested. He turned out to be an amazing investor. And, again, we started in 00, that was a bad time to start. It got worse by 2001, after September 11th. It got really bad then. And, 01 through like the end of 03 was like the worst time of my history, right? It was a pretty bleak time. And then things started to really take off in 04, and then we got acquired in 07.
It's a long time to.
It's a long
time to keep showing up to work when
yes.
It's hard to feel good.
Yeah.
What kept you going through that? That was a very challenging time for everybody.
Yeah.
Not just
a bunch of things. I think one, like we had this amazing investor. He turned out to be an amazing investor and kind of an amazing mentor to me. Still, he's retired at this point. And he has been to lots of other people that I found over the years. So he believed in us. I don't know why. Maybe he didn't believe in us, but he conveyed that he believed in us. And he kept and he could have folded the company many times over, right? He had no reason to do this. His other two companies, one was acquired by 3M, it was a company called Brontis, which was like Eric Paley, who runs Founders Collective. That was his company. And the other one was Netiza, which went public and then subsequently got acquired by IBM, right? And then it was us. That was the three companies that he had left before retiring. And he believed in us kind of more than we believed in ourselves. That was one reason. The other reason was we started this company and I had a large team at that point, and each one of those, each person on that team I personally recruited, and we were going to see this through no matter what.
So 7 years, all digital intelligence for marketers, you were acquired. And then after that, it sounds like the next company I have on the list is Lookery, which kind of feels like you were applying what you learned to compete and what you might have learned at Bolt.
A little bit,
doing
yeah.
an ad network for
social.
Social. Tell us a little bit about that. That was 2 years.
Yeah, around 2 years. So after Compete, so Compete got acquired I took a little time off, did nothing, basically, for a little while, and which I'm not good at. I'm very bad at that. And a friend that I had in San Francisco, his company had been acquired by Yahoo, and so we both were doing nothing and just hanging out. And at the same time, like Facebook had just launched its platform, like the FB platform. They had just released that in '07, that summer of '07, right? The platform had just come out, right? And so developers were starting to build apps on this platform. And we had a bunch of friends who had apps in those systems, in that system, and they were growing really fast. They didn't really know what they were going to do with those things. A number of them turned out to be pretty big, like Mark Pincus, that was a friend of ours. He started, turned out to be Zing, that was one of our first customers. Noah Kagan had an ad network. He had many ad networks. He had just left Facebook. Like that's when I met him back then in '07, and he had many games, and Noah's got a lot of things going on all the time. Like he was one of our early customers. There's a number of other big companies that came out at that time, but anyway, at that time they were still trying to figure it out. And my friend in San Francisco was like, we should just create an ad network, because traditional ad networks were not comfortable being on the platform yet, and so we created one. It's kind of a really bad way to start a company. Like all of my companies have been like obsession based. Like I want to learn something, I'm obsessed about something. This was like we're not doing anything, we're not really thinking about it. Like our friends are doing this stuff, so we'll help them out. We'll start this ad network. Like, and we were kind of like coasting at that time. We weren't really that serious about it, and kept trying to ignore kind of the thing. Anyway, that ended up being an ad network for social applications. Most of them were games at the time, but there were other types of social applications. We learned a bunch of not great stuff going through that process. One was like Facebook was horrible. I mean, they've gotten better, but they're still pretty bad. Like horrible about like shutting off, like Twitter has, people who build on top of their API. So all of a sudden, like we'd have a bunch of customers in a certain category, and they'd be like, "Oh, no more dating category, shut it down." And no one could get an explanation why. Like it was gone the next day. And then, but we promised we wouldn't shut anything else down. And then like 3 months later, no more whatever. Or Zing is the only one who gets, Farmville is the only one who gets this or what. And so building on someone else's platform was insane. We ultimately took the ad network and sold it to a company called Ad Knowledge, a big ad network, and then used the rest of the money to fund the company. And we started to build something which was super geeky, but it was basically, it's pretty common now. We call it a demand-side platform, like a DSP. Back when we were doing it, it was kind of hard because we were assuming that there were engineers at any of these ad networks, and there were no engineers at any ad network that we dealt with. They were all salespeople. And so we'd say, oh, we built this API, this real-time API, and you could hit it, and then you could target ads based on these dimensions and whatever, and they'd be like, API? And you're like, what? We just have salespeople. There's no one to integrate. I mean, that's changed. That's radically changed now, and everything's programmatic at this point. But it wasn't at that point. I left Lookery to start Performable, 2011. Then my co-founder kept running it for a little while, ultimately shut it down.
Let's talk about Performable. Did you say 2009?
2009.
2009.
Yeah.
So it's a company you started, software for sales and marketing.
Yeah.
Spent about 2 years working on it before it was acquired by HubSpot. HubSpot, obviously, very much loved company in Boston. What was that experience like, and what has it been like, in the 3 years since at HubSpot?
So I did one thing in between there that I mentioned. I did a side project called Ghostery. It's a browser plugin, basically privacy plugin. I did that kind of right after leaving Lookery and before starting Performable. And it was just something that I did for myself, and I didn't think anyone cared about it. And I kept trying to dismiss it as a business. I ultimately sold it to a company which is now called Ghostery Enterprise in New York. It was called Videon. because I didn't think it was a business. But even, when I sold it, I had it was just me. I had 3 million users using it and passionate about it. And it was the first thing that was more consumer oriented. So I'd have like people saying, oh, I was at work today and my boss was using GhostStream. I'd be like, what did they use GhostStream for? Like, it's like, to me, it was a geeky little privacy tool. But now it's, I think they have that to like 31, 32 million people using it.
It was just you by yourself that built that?
Yeah.
You had mentioned to me that you tend to be introverted,
Yes.
that you like to spend a lot of time alone. So that
Yeah, so that was my little side project. Then actually the guy that I started Lookery with was the one who convinced me to make it public. I had it on running it locally. Then he wanted to run it, and but I still didn't think that anybody cared about it. And then, in a couple of months, it was like 3 million people using it, but I still kept ignoring it. And, but anyway, that was GhostStream. And then I started Performable in kind of the fall of 2011. And basically, one thing that I had been looking at all my startups was like, two most important things. One of them, there's lots of important things, but the 2 things I was focused on was market, right? Like, and had never really been looking at it that way, in my other startups. And then timing. Timing is not something that you can control, but it had, if you look back at everything I did, like timing was the critical factor. Like you'd say like, Bolt was like way too fucking early, it was like 10 years early. Then like Compete was like way early, right? Like, oh, if I would have started that in 03, then it would have been great, because 03 to 07 would have been a hockey stick, right? So that was early. And then kept going, and just like Lookery was too early, but not by much. Like Blue Kai and X-Lay came out, and a couple other people after us. And then Performable, I was kind of, in the starting that I was really thinking about like marketing. Like, is the market ready? What is changing in the market? And is there something that is there a momentum that we can build on versus all my other startups having to build momentum on my own, right? And so Performable was kind of like taking some of the stuff that we learned at Compete. So at Compete, we sold to big brands mostly, and it was pretty expensive. So our average subscription was like $600,000 a year. And we'd sell multiple subscriptions into major brands, and but it was data at the end, and it was hard for anyone to take action. Even though like some companies were paying us like millions of dollars, they'd get the data, and then we'd be like, so now you must act on it, and they'd be like, I can't really do that. It's like, so what do you want the data for? I'm going to prove it to my boss that I can do this. Why can't you do this? Because we were selling to marketers, they'd say, well, we don't have any IT resources, and so we use an agency, or many agencies, and the agency won't be back for 6 months, and then in 6 months we might be doing this. And a lot of our companies that we were dealing with were really heavy on the arbitrage side, right? That was really growing at that time because of PPC, everything from like insurance to like Lending Tree, those kind of companies. But even those companies were pretty slow to react. So when starting Performable, I was obsessed with like, if I was going to do data again, like it had to be tied to actions. Like the data would have to result in an action that a marketer could do on their own. And that was kind of like the premise for starting Performable.
Which you had said with all the others, they were early and you were still zeroing in, but even for Performable, that was still quite a novel idea at the time, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was, I think it was novel. I think that we were timed pretty well. I think, the thing that we saw changing was that the number of channels that a marketer had to support was exploding, right? We were going from a time from where a marketer was supporting, email and a website and, microsite and maybe Twitter to like Twitter and Facebook and Pinterest and this and that and all these social channels that they had pressure and mobile channels, their iPhone strategy, iPad strategy, Android strategy. It'd be like the same number of marketers would have to support all of these new channels. So we were looking at like, can we create something that works across all those channels, unifies, and makes it easier? And like we saw like the number of channels that they would have to support was only increasing, right? And so the pain was going to get better.
Just to take a step back, so you were at Performable, you are now at your 5th startup in 15 or so years, right? What did you see kind of in yourself? Like, did you find yourself enjoying the same things? Have you become amazing in particular things, or like what things have you learned about yourself during that time?
I think, the biggest thing for me is like what I care about each day, like kind of shifting, right? So it started from my first company where I was an engineer, and I cared about like the engineering parts, right? Like the creating, the building part, and that was what I was obsessed about, right? Like the actual like building stuff. Then over time, it became that's important. I still geek out on that stuff, and then I became more interested in kind of like the design and the user experience and the kind of flow, and then geek out on that stuff too. And then by the time Performable came around, I was more interested in like, well, how do you build like teams that work here, right? Like I had large groups before and amazing people on compete was like 150, 160 when we got acquired, and but I found like at that point like we didn't have a really great team in my opinion, like that was cohesive, right? And I wanted a great culture, right? It's almost like if you listen to the Tony Hsieh story, like the company, I kind of had the same feeling with compete, like it's great, but that wasn't the culture that I wanted, and didn't feel like super high performance teams, and how could I do that? And so I kind of became obsessed about that. And to this day, like I care more about, especially after my Hubspot experience, the last 3 years of building another big team. Like now I'm like, oh, it's 95% people at least, and then everything else is 5%.
Has that number been going up over the years?
Yeah, it's going up. It's going to be 99%. So like that's everything, right? At the end of the day, we're just humans, right? And so the robots come, and we need to be able to communicate with each other. We need to be able to work with each other. We need to be able to create together. And I still care about all this stuff. About the engineering part and the design and this and that. And but those are not the important parts to me. And so I really care about like how do you create an amazing team, and how do you be around people that you want to be around.
So Performable was acquired by Hubspot.
Mm-hmm.
You stayed on as chief of product for 3 years.
Yeah.
It sounds like there must have been a pretty good match there. But this is probably your first 3-year job in a long time.
It's my first job.
First job.
I've never gone as part of any acquisition before. The HubSpot thing was interesting. I knew Dharmesh from 2007 when I was at Compete. He was starting HubSpot at that time, and he was looking for data. We had a data API at that point, so that's how we met. And I knew most of the investors in HubSpot. Like Larry Vaughn, he's General Catalyst, was the first investor. I knew Larry from 2000. Then Larry was running a public company, he was CEO of a public company. I knew David Scott for a long time. I knew all these guys for a long time. I knew most of the management team at HubSpot for a long time, so it was kind of close relationship. Even from the beginning, from when we started Performable, and by the time we were acquired, it was probably the fourth or fifth time they had tried to acquire us. Right in that, we were around for 1.5 years before we got acquired, before the ultimate acquisition. So they had been trying to acquire us because they needed help, and they thought in the kind of in the area that we were building in, right, more of the middle of the funnel kind of market space. I don't know, it was hard. Still, at the time, I couldn't come up with a single reason that we were doing the acquisition. Because we didn't have to. I mean, we were doing great as a company. We had raised the Series A from CRV. We had kind of preemptive offers for Series B, which were very attractive to do. And so really was going back and forth on whether we do it or not. I think, a couple of things led me to do it. One, we had kind of a shared culture. We were building, the culture was very similar. So that was like the most important thing to me. Two, we both wanted to create something big. And they weren't going to sell that company anytime soon or never. So that was interesting to me. And I just thought it was, we could be like, we could amplify kind of what they had created so far. They were really good at sailing all together. We could probably create something interesting. But it was pretty hard to still look back and still don't have a single one reason why we did it. But it was definitely the right thing to do.
Sure. So 3 years at HubSpot.
Yeah, which I never thought I'd do.
Sounds like it was a great ride.
Yeah.
You guys must have been doing something right.
Yeah.
And now it was just a couple of months back was announced that yourself and Elias
Yeah.
are stepping away from HubSpot. Do you feel comfortable talking about kind of what's
Sure.
cooking?
We decided to leave HubSpot in June, July this year, and have been kind of like winding down. Our official last day was last week, and for us, we were ready to start a new company, HubSpot. We felt like our mission was done at HubSpot. We had come in thinking that it was sort of a product problem, and then really discovering like, oh, we have to rebuild 100% of everything here, and we have to rebuild, 80% or 90, actually more, probably 90% of the team. I was like, oh, okay, and we need to like grow like crazy. And, we have to like go from what we had at that point, 5,000, 4,000 or 5,000 customers to like 12,000 customers, and kind of go off market at the same time. Right? What we built to replace it wasn't for an SMB market; it was kind of mid-market solution, so it was a lot more sophisticated. So the challenge was amazing, but we felt like we had done that. We had finished that challenge, and we were ready to. And the team was awesome and stable, and we could finally walk away and start something new. And so we're off starting something. We haven't talked about it much, but our name, our company name is Drift. Actually, there's three of us. Marshall is the third. It's myself, Marshall, and Elias, and we're off building something new.
Awesome. Looking forward to
seeing what it is.
Yeah,
we do too. We'll find out soon.
I wanted to leave at least 10 minutes at the end for questions, so we have about 10 more minutes. You're an advisor to lots of companies in the Boston area. I have a list of VCs and companies. What types of companies do you like working with, and what do you see? What really excites you? What types of industries do you like?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been lucky to invest or advise or whatever, be involved in a lot of companies. I think for me, the way that I go about it is like I just want to be around passionate people. That's another reason that kind of gravitated to starting companies. Was that for my kind of personality, I need to be around people who are passionate and know what they're doing. And I have zero tolerance for like being around people who are not into what they do. Like I can't actually understand it. It's more of like I can't understand that. And so I need to be around really passionate people, and those companies or venture firms or whatever just ended up being people that I wanted to be around, and so I agreed to help them out. But that's probably not a good thesis, right, for the selection. But for me, I don't have much time, so like whatever time I have, it has to be around. I have to be around people that I want to be around. And so what I think.
Did you want to talk a little bit about I had a list of three lessons that you had kind of picked up over the years. I really like don't be in the middle. There's no secret. Did you talk about a couple of those?
Yeah, I mean they're mostly like rants, right? So I just like I don't blog that often, or I'm mostly on Twitter, but like everything that I write is pretty much a rant. And they're all around the same thing, which is just like you just have to start something, right? Like I'm naturally an introverted personality, and I like geeking out about data, and I can get lost in all that stuff, but at the end of the day, like you have to go out there and just kind of experience these things, and that's another thing that's kind of changed for me over the years. Like I used to know about like everything, everything is about being qualitative, right? Like, from hiring to like what we were building to like measure like everything, and like at this point I'm totally like it's all about like how my gut feels, right? Like, and that so far has never failed me, right? Like this obsession around looking at a certain number, which everything can be gained, failed often. And so and all of that was basically at best, kind of looking in the rearview mirror and trying to detect patterns. And so all my rants are about like just get out there and start something. There is no secret that you have to pick an edge, right? And it's one that I talk about a lot, which is like this kind of never be in the middle. In most things, like you have to be at one end or the other. You have to be at some extreme end, and like if you have an idea and you talk to someone about it. And this is Matt Lauzon, Jim Barrow founder.
I'm honored to see Dave Cancel here.
What's going on, brother? And
I would listen, but
this beer is
I have something I have to get done by the
Yeah,
minute.
you got work to do. You have to pick an edge, and for me, like if you have an idea that you convey to someone or a product that you're testing, what I like is like an extreme reaction to it, and which is like someone tells me they hate it, and it's the worst thing they've ever seen, and it's crap or whatever, and never use it. It's a pretty good reaction in my book. Or the other is like I love it and I'm passionate about it. For me, the worst thing is always kind of the difference. It's kind of, like, it's kind of cool. I would use it, maybe if it had this, like, that's the worst thing possible. It's much better for someone to hate, because at least it's an emotional response that you're tapping into. You can work with that. You can't work with the difference. You can work with that feeling. But I find like most of us, including myself, try to run away from like that, having negative feedback, or negative feedback is great.
Well, so it's been great talking to you. I'd love to keep going. I wanted to at least give the audience a chance to ask some questions.
I'm JJ Rohrer. I run School Chase, which is about to launch a PTA management system. My question is this. You have grown and sold more companies than the typical person. You've had more insight into seeing kind of what has worked well and what hasn't worked well. From your perspective, like what has been kind of the difference of like your successful transitions and your less successful ones, other than timing, which is kind of hard to control.
Transitions
as transitions in like going from I own it to I don't own it anymore.
I think good transitions. I don't know if I'm good at transitions.
Good you.
Yeah, but I've had them a lot. For me, I've always left when I feel like any of the things that I've started or been a part of, when I feel like I'm not learning anymore. Right? And that's something that I've only figured out looking in the rearview mirror. Like never realized it at the time. Like it was a pretty clear pattern now. If I think back, I'm like, oh yeah, it's pretty simple. Okay. The minute that I felt like I wasn't learning anymore, I wasn't contributing, then that's the time to leave. But that also meant, luckily it meant that there were other people that were filling in and doing most of running the day-to-day stuff, and so it was easy for me to transition out. I don't know if that's a good transition.
Well, then, a part of that is obviously the financial component.
Yeah.
So you've addressed the personal side.
Sure.
But what about the financial side? Like what has worked better in your perspective and what hasn't? Like what has been successful?
In terms of making money?
Sure.
Yeah.
You have some numbers.
I have some money.
Yeah. You have some data points.
I don't think I'm a good person to ask that question. Like I think I can't do anything for money. Like I don't know, I'm not motivated by money. So like luckily I've been successful and fortunate. But like if I was motivated by money, I would have made different choices. I probably have more money, frankly. But I wouldn't want to do it. Like for me, it has to be about learning, about really wanting to being obsessed about what I'm doing. That's what kind of motivates me. And I have never been able to make a decision based on for financial reasons. So yeah, I'm not a good person for financial advice.
Thanks.
Talk about culture, organizational culture. How have you managed to maintain culture when you've grown and scaled businesses? Have you got any tips on that?
Sure. I mean, we had some really started to focus in on it at Performable. I'd say before Performable, I was not really focused on culture. Just focused on product and growing and getting the smartest people possible. But the smartest people possible do not always make a great team. Right? Or they're not always very effective. Right? And it's hard to make them effective, let's say. And so at Performable and really Performable through Hubspot, really been focused on, well, how do you scale this? At Performable, when we were acquired, we were like 23, 24. So it was small sample size. I didn't know if it would actually work. And then at Hubspot, we ended up hiring like, on our team, I don't know, 150 some odd people. So really got to test it out. And for for me, I found like all the things that were key to scaling those teams in terms of culture were kind of like the things that were the exact opposite of what people focus in on. Right? Like people focus in on, and they were the things that you would consider to be not scalable, right? And people want to usually give them away. And so we had this kind of upside down model, always from Performable to HubSpot, like the servant leadership model, meaning like the higher your title is, like the lower you are on the higher your title is, the more your job is to support people who love you. And like in our kind of funnel, it was like customers and individuals were at the top of the team, and like I was at the bottom, right? And so what does that mean in practice? It means like that you literally have to support everyone in your team, and like everyone who made decisions on our teams were the individuals on the team. They had control over, like, we didn't have things like release, roadmaps or dates or anything like that, kind of from a product organization. We trusted the teams, they decided all that on their own. We didn't have a centralized kind of project management process. Each individual team decided on their own and even what tools they wanted to use, and basically just had a culture of autonomy, right? And all of our jobs were kind of to support that, right? And so like that meant like, we do this all the time, that if someone was upset because we didn't have pizza today, then I would go and start my day getting pizza, and we would do that literally every day. Or someone complained there's no more M&Ms, so I go to Glam and get M&Ms, right? Like not I ask somebody else to go get M&Ms, like I go get M&Ms, because like what they're doing is the most important thing, right? And we're here to support them. And there's lots of different, that's one little example, but all the things that seem to be not scalable are the key. And another one is one-on-ones. Like everyone wants to like run away from one-on-ones, and I'm so kind of religious about one-on-ones. And we would do them with everyone, and everyone. Like you're a co-op, you're an intern, whatever, you need to have one-on-one. But all the people kind of like in the middle who were like managers and whatnot always wanted to run away from one-on-ones. Like, oh, I can't do that. I'm too busy. I'm scheduling this. I'm whatever meeting. It's like that's the most important thing. This like project management stuff that you're doing is useless. Like give that actually to the engineers. Like let them run their own project management. Like they don't need you to do that. You need to focus on like one-on-ones. Like and know like why is Bridge, the co-op, he does not feel motivated. Like that's like the most important thing. Right? So I would ask like all the time, like a manager or something, I'd be like, what is Bridge up to? And be like, oh, I don't know. I haven't caught up with him yet. So I don't know how this team's gonna work if you don't even know like if he's happy, sad, or not. So those are the keys for us.
So why do you think it's so much harder for B2C companies to raise money in Boston compared to the West Coast?
You asked the wrong guy. I've done all B2B companies. Why is it harder? I don't know. I haven't raised B2C money. I think it's kind of I don't know, a lot of people like to think that maybe it is an insider club. I don't know, but I'm from New York. I'm like half Puerto Rican, half Ecuadorian. I don't look like the Boston inside crowd, and so I don't know. I've been in the inside crowd. I don't know. I can't tell you why. I haven't had much. It's been easy for me to raise money. Luckily, I don't know why.
Right, because when I talk to, right, B2B is still people get it here, right? They keep saying, oh, you go to West Coast, you'll raise it in a heartbeat. It's not like it's a different
Maybe. Yeah. In some cases, that's true. In a lot of cases, it's not. Depends on what you're trying to pitch. Like, I find like back to the middle conversation, like most people that I feel like that I talk to who are struggling to raise money are always trying to raise money at the wrong time. It's usually in the middle, right? It's some variation of the middle. It's the worst time to raise money. Like, if you're raising money, you got to raise money on an edge. Total dream. You got to go out and find a true believer. You have no code, you have no demo, you have no tech, you have nothing to show them. But you're going to convince them of the dream. That's usually where I've always raised money on the dream stage. I like nothing. Oh, let me see a screenshot. There's no screenshot. Who's working on it? There's no, whatever. Like, but basically what you're doing there, what you're qualifying is like, you're qualifying people who share the same dream as you. If you can find someone who has the same dream as you, then you have a shot. It also means you're disqualifying a lot of people, but that's okay. You want to find a true believer. And anyone who's asking you for more pieces of data at that stage, that's not going to convince them. I've never seen it happen where you produce some magical piece of data that convinces them. That only creates more exceptions for them, right? And so that most people try to raise in the middle when they bootstrapped a little, they have a demo, they've spent money, now they really need to raise money, and now you're going to an investor with an insane number of variables. Right? Like, you have a demo, but I don't like the demo. The demo sucks. Oh, you have 5,000 people using, well, why isn't it 15,000 people? You have 2 people working for you, why don't I have 3 people? You know, it's like, that is kind of their job to some degree. Like, everything is like, why isn't it better? Right? You use too many variables, you're like, this is a selling process, right? Like, you introduce all these variables that you cannot control at this point. The only time that you want to introduce variables are when you have traction, right? That's the other edge. You have traction, it's provable, it's undeniable, and it's easy to raise money, but everyone tries to raise in this kind of the valley of death in the middle, because they feel like, oh, everyone told me I need a demo, or I need to prove it to myself, or I need to do something. It's the worst time. If you try to raise money there, it almost never happens. That's where most companies end up dying. So you got to raise at the dream, and not everyone can sell the dream. If you can't, then you can only raise money on traction. There's no in between. No middle.
No middles, right?
What's one thing you're going to do differently this time?
So that's Jonathan Kim. He's Performable and Hubspot. What am I going to do differently this time? We don't have an office. We're working out of a rock gym. Marshall is schooling us all on climbing. I'm already injured. My arm's already injured. That's one thing we're doing differently. We're just starting out. We're fortunate we have a great team, the 3 of us, and just working on the stuff. And we're just going to go very slow and just figure it out at this point. So there's no. Luckily, we're at a place that we don't have any pressure, and so, or at least no. I have plenty of pressure I put on myself, but like no external pressure, so we're just like figuring it out. So that's very different from before, where even at Performable, by that point, I still felt like still have something to prove, like externally, like we need to get going, and we were kind of racing from day one. That's Jonathan can tell you, and that turned out great, but we're just going to take it a little slower this time. And maybe we won't have an office anytime soon.
How have you, I assume you've used mentors and advisors, how have you gotten the most out of them? And what kind of roles do they play, and what kind of people did you look for?
Sure. So I have used mentors more, but advisors as well. Kind of in a very different way than I found like most people want to use mentors and advisors. Like, so I have several mentors that I've used for a long time, and they've been great because they've always they're people that I trust, people that I feel like can help me with one of my many deficiencies, or kind of strong in one of my deficiencies, and just again people that I want to be around, and so they're kind of true friendships. Those have been great, and then at various companies like Performable, we had a bunch of advisors that we brought in. I'd say with the advisors, I've looked at that as pretty different. I feel like when I talk to people who have asked me to be an advisor, most of them, what they're asking for is like they want me to be like work for them for part-time or full-time, right? Like I'm gonna work for them, like be available like 24/7 to this thing. Like that's gonna be a hard sell to get someone to be an advisor in that situation, and that's not a good use of an advisor. I thought of advisors as like only having a very short, like for me, like a 6-month window, 6 month to 12-month window max. And for them, I wouldn't, I didn't even have vesting for my advisors because that was kind of my signal to them, like, I'm not going to rope them into some 4-year vesting thing or even 2-year vesting thing. Like, I'm going to vest them right up front, and we're going to begin this relationship with me not even asking them for anything. But the reason that I've asked them to be an advisor is like I know, like in the next 6 months, I'm going to have an ask or maybe a couple of asks that I'm going to ask them. I'm not going to have weekly calls, monthly calls, whatever. I'm just going to have them on board and ready on my side for the minute that I have that ask. And by the time we were acquired at Performable, like we had some great advisors like Sean Ellis and lots of other people like that, and I had never even asked them for anything, right? And it turned out great for them financially. But that's kind of how I look at advisors. It's just like almost like cards that you're putting like in your pocket, like I'm going to use this card at some point, not as like, let me figure out how you can work for me part-time for equity, which never works, right? Very few, I've known people who are advisors, very few of them have made money from being an advisor, right? It's really like because they want to help the company. It's not a good way to make money. You would almost never make money.
I think a lot of us are familiar with the culture at HubSpot. I'm just wondering if you have any other favorites in the city.
In town. Yeah, there's smaller companies. Whiskey has a great culture. Let's see who else has a great culture. Our company has a great culture. It's Marshall. Marshall's really culture. Let's see. Yeah, there are lots of companies. Not all in Boston, I'd say. They're just all over the place that we admire. Big Commerce is a company that I'm involved with. They're in Austin, Sydney, and San Francisco. They have an awesome culture too. But I'd say whiskey is probably the one that one of the ones I like most in town. Or others don't. Oh, Help Scout. Help Scout's a great company, great culture too. Love those guys.
So when you were talking about like market and timing and like looking into that when you started your company, what would you say are like the higher level general factors you looked at?
One that the momentum was already there, right, and that we weren't going to be the first company in, so that we saw examples of companies already starting to move down this path and having some success. Meaning some financial, I've been B2B companies, so these are companies that are actually selling well, right, in their category. For me, it's never been like, oh, there's lots of startups in this area. It's like, who cares? I don't know, I had a post about that at one point, and that was with a friend, actually. Heaton, who runs Kiss Metrics, right? Like, at one point, we started Performable, he was like, oh, we're going to be competitors, and I was like, Heaton, if like, you and I are competitors at the end of the day, we should just like shut this down right now. Because like, at the end of the day, if the market's me and you, so she and next panel, all right, that doesn't seem really great. I'm going to be here for a very long time. Like, I want my competitor to be like Omniture and Adobe and some of these public companies that were at that point. I don't want to be like a bunch of startups as competitors. And so we're looking for companies that have proved kind of traction early, and for some reason maybe are not compelling. Right? The product's not compelling, their go-to-market's not compelling, or something has changed in the market that is introducing new go-to-market that we can take advantage of. But this provable momentum there already.
I think we're just about out of time. Thank you very much.
Thanks.